That afternoon at Frostlake felt too perfect to be real. The Vaughan family's lake house stood like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Dark wood wide glass windows, every corner screaming wealth and order. But behind that polish, I always sensed something colder. I sat on the porch a little away from everyone, pretending to enjoy the pine-scented air, while my daughter Sophie poured drinks for her husband Liam and his father Richard Vaughan. They laughed too loudly, that kind of forced laughter people use when they're already halfway drunk. Sophie joined in her voice, bright and trembling at the edges. I knew that tone. It was the sound of a girl trying not to disappoint, desperate to be accepted by people who only saw her as an accessory. She had always been like that. Even when she was a kid, she wanted everyone to get along. And that gentle heart of hers, the same heart I used to call her gift, had turned into her curse the day she married into the Vaughans. The Vaughan family liked to keep up appearances. The lawn was trimmed to perfection, not a single leaf out of place. The house was silent cold, like even the air inside had rules. They liked everything flawless, including the people who stood beside them. Sophie didn't realize she was expected to play a part, not to be herself. Why's our little city girl all bundled up? Richard finally asked, his voice booming across the porch. He was a tall man, broad shoulders, white hair combed back like he was still auditioning for power. Sophie laughed nervously. "It's chilly, Dad." "Chilly, Liam," echoed his father, smirking. "Back in my day, women swam in October. They weren't afraid of a little cold." I felt it then, that tightening in my chest that mothers know too well. The kind that whispers something bad is about to happen. "Leave her alone, Richard," I said softly, but my voice barely made it through the tension in the air. Liam turned, amusement flashing in his eyes. He always hated when I spoke up. To him I was just the overprotective mother-in-law who didn't know when to stay quiet. "Relax, Emma," he said, smirking. "We're just having a little fun." Sophie forced a smile, eyes flicking between them. "It's fine, Mum," she whispered. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. I saw it, the exchange of glances between Richard and Liam, that silent male code built on dominance and mockery, the kind that turns cruelty into entertainment. Richard stood his shadow stretching across the deck. "Let's see how tough you really are, Sophie," he said, his grin widening. Liam laughed. "Come on, sweetheart, it'll be fun." Before I could react, they each grabbed one of her arms. Sophie gasped, confused at first, thinking it was another one of their jokes. But when her laughter turned into a frightened cry, I knew. "Stop! What are you doing?" I yelled, standing up so fast, the chair toppled behind me. They didn't even look back. The sound of the wind off the lake was sharp and cold, biting through my jacket as I ran after them. They dragged her toward the end of the dock, where the water shimmered like a sheet of dark glass. "Don't," I screamed. "You're drunk, you don't know what you're doing," but they did know. They just didn't care. Sophie's voice broke. "Liam, please." "Dad, stop." Her words were swallowed by the laughter behind her. And then, with a single shove, they pushed her. The splash cut through the air like a slap. The ripples spread fast across the black surface, swallowing the reflection of the house lights. For a second, everything went silent. Too silent. I waited for her to come up. 1 second. 2. 3. Nothing. Then Richard laughed. That deep, careless laugh I will never forget. "That'll wake her up," he said. Liam joined in. They stood there, heads thrown back, like they'd just told the funniest joke in the world. But the lake didn't laugh. It stayed quiet, dark and still. And when Sophie's head finally broke the surface, her face was pale, her eyes wide and lost. I saw the blood, a thin, dark line trailing down her temple. Then she sank again, her body heavy and limp. I screamed her name over and over, but they didn't turn back. Liam's voice came faintly through the cold wind. "She's fine, Emma." "Stop being dramatic." Richard waved dismissively. "She can swim. Let's go." They walked away, just like that. The sound of their car starting echoed across the shore. Gravel crunched, headlights flared, then vanished down the long driveway. And I was left alone, just me, the water, and the terrible silence of a mother who'd realized no one was coming to help. The sound of the car engine faded, leaving behind nothing but the wind and the slow ripple of the lake. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen mid-air, useless against the black water that had swallowed my daughter. The world around me seemed to blur, the trees, the pier. Even the colour of the sky lost its shape. All I could hear was my own breathing, ragged and sharp, and the faint lapping of waves against the wood. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. Far beyond the reeds, a small motorboat was drifting across the lake. At first, I thought I was imagining it. My mind had already begun to play tricks on me. But then I saw him. A man in a worn camouflage jacket, leaning forward, his boat engine sputtering softly. He looked like every man I'd passed at the local bait shop on summer mornings, the kind who'd rather talk about the weather than their own lives. Later, I would learn his name was Mark Jensen, a 50-something fisherman who lived on the far side of Frostlake. That evening, he was my only miracle. I tried to call out, but my throat burned from screaming. No sound came. I just raised my arm and pointed at the spot where Sophie had gone under. Mark must have understood the panic in my gesture, because he turned the motor sharply and gunned it toward the dock. The roar broke the silence like thunder rolling through an empty valley. When he reached the pier, he didn't waste a second. He grabbed a long boat hook and began scanning the water, his eyes focused and steady. The way he moved told me this wasn't the first time he'd pulled someone out of the lake. He worked with quiet urgency. No hesitation. No words. Every movement was deliberate, as if he'd done this 100 times before. And then I saw it, a flash of fabric beneath the surface. He leaned over, dangerously far, hooked something and pulled. The weight of it almost dragged him in, but he held on. Sophie's body broke the surface limp, her skin a shade of blue no mother should ever see. Her hair clung to her face, her lips pale as snow. Mark hauled her into the boat and started chest compressions immediately. The dull rhythm of his hands pressing against her chest echoed across the water. I stumbled down from the dock, fell to my knees, and reached for my phone. My fingers wouldn't work at first. They shook too much. But somehow I managed to dial 911. My voice came out strange, detached, almost mechanical. I gave them the address, described what happened, repeated it twice. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could barely hear her over the pounding in my ears. Behind me, Mark was still working, counting under his breath, breathing for her, refusing to give up. As the sirens approached, my mind filled with flashes of Sophie at every age. Her tiny hands covered in paint after kindergarten. Her teenage grin, all braces and hope. The way she looked on her wedding day, radiant, trusting, so sure that love could fix anything. I thought about how many times I'd stayed silent for her sake. How I'd smiled through dinners with people who mocked me, who mocked her, because I believed that keeping the peace was the same as protecting her. I realized, kneeling there on the shore, that silence had never kept anyone safe. When the ambulance arrived, red lights danced across the lake's surface, turning the water into a moving painting of fear and hope. Paramedics rushed down the dock with a stretcher, their voices clipped and efficient. They lifted Sophie carefully, wrapping her in a silver rescue blanket. One of them checked her pulse. "Faint," I heard him say. We've got a chance. I wanted to believe those words. I wanted to breathe again. But all I felt was emptiness. The hollow kind that comes after the worst has already happened when your body hasn't caught up with your heart. Mark stood a few feet away. His jacket soaked his hands, trembling slightly from the cold. When our eyes met, he nodded once the way people do when there's nothing left to say. It wasn't sympathy. It was understanding. The quiet acknowledgement between two strangers who had both seen something they would never forget. They loaded Sophie into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. The siren wailed, and the vehicle sped down the narrow road toward the hospital. I stood there staring at the disappearing red lights until they melted into the night. In that silence, something inside me shifted. The panic that had consumed me only minutes ago hardened into something colder, sharper. Fear was gone, replaced by a single terrible clarity. I didn't yet know how, but I knew this: the men who laughed while my daughter drowned would never laugh again. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. It isn't peaceful like the one you find in nature. It's heavy, thick, full of questions no one wants to answer. That night, I sat in a cold plastic chair outside the emergency room, watching the red light above the door flicker. Somewhere behind that door, my daughter was fighting for her life. They said she had severe hypothermia, a concussion water in her lungs. She was alive, but barely. Every time a nurse rushed past, my heart jumped, waiting for news that never came soon enough. I didn't cry. Maybe because I had no tears left. Or maybe because I'd already cried too many times for the same reasons. Fear, helplessness, watching my daughter get hurt and being unable to protect her. But something about that night was different. The fear didn't consume me anymore. It started to transform, hardening into something steadier, colder, sharper. I pulled out my phone. For a long time, I just stared at it. My contact list was full of names that suddenly felt useless. Then, without really thinking, I scrolled down to one name I hadn't touched in years: Andrew. My brother. Andrew and I hadn't spoken much since Mum's funeral. He'd gone his own way, reckless, brilliant, stubborn. Once he'd been an investigative journalist, the kind who didn't flinch when powerful people tried to shut him up. But his methods were too direct, too personal. He exposed people who weren't used to being exposed, and eventually he paid the price. Lost his job, his press badge, his reputation. Back then, I thought he'd gone too far. I told him to stop digging into dangerous stories. He told me the truth mattered more than comfort. We stopped talking not because we stopped caring, but because we stopped agreeing on what doing the right thing really meant. But tonight, sitting in that sterile hallway, I realized I finally understood him. I pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost hung up. Then his deep, gravelly voice came through, older now, but still steady. Yeah. He didn't recognize my number. I swallowed hard. Andrew. It's me, I said quietly. Emma. A long pause followed. I could almost picture him standing there in his small apartment, straightening his back, realizing something serious had happened. He didn't ask questions. He never did. I'm listening, he finally said. I looked out the window at the hospital parking lot. A single police car drove by, its lights flashing blue across the glass. Beyond that darkness. Somewhere out there, Richard Vaughan and his son were probably sitting comfortably in their mansion, pouring another drink, laughing, already convinced they'd gotten away with it. They're heading home now, I whispered. Do what you do best. Then I hung up. It was the easiest and hardest call I'd ever made. The fear that had lived in me for years, the kind that made me shrink, apologize, tolerate, disappeared. In its place came a strange calm. It wasn't peace. It was purpose. When you reach a certain point in life, when someone you love has been hurt enough times, you stop waiting for justice. You start becoming it. I watched through the glass doors as the ambulance crew transferred Sophie to the ICU. The reflection of their red and white lights flashed against my face like a silent warning. A nurse touched my arm, telling me they'd let me know when I could see her. I nodded, though I barely heard her. I walked to the vending machine at the end of the hallway, bought a coffee I didn't drink, and sat back down. The chair creaked beneath me. Somewhere inside, machines beeped steadily like a mechanical heartbeat, keeping time with my thoughts. I realized that the woman I'd been patient, forgiving, endlessly accommodating was gone. The one who replaced her was someone I didn't recognize. But maybe that was the point. When someone crosses a line that deep, the kind that steals your child's breath and leaves her floating in the dark, you don't turn the other cheek. You don't pray for karma to notice. You act. You calculate. You make sure the world finally sees what it tried to ignore. I didn't know what Andrew would do, or how far he'd go. But I knew one thing for certain: when my brother moved, things changed. And this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. The air in that hallway was cold, almost metallic. I could still smell the lake on my jacket, a mix of mud water and fear. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The old Emma had lived by rules. The new one had none left to follow. Back at the Vaughan mansion, the world felt strangely undisturbed. Richard and Liam came home just as the sun slipped behind the trees, spilling gold across the manicured lawn. The lake was only a mile away, yet it could have been on another planet. The air smelled of whiskey and pine, the house of money and arrogance. Inside, everything looked the same: leather sofas, spotless marble floors, dim lights reflecting on glass. They moved through it like kings returning from a hunt. Liam tossed his jacket over a chair and laughed, that same careless laugh that had followed my daughter into the water. Richard loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. His hand was steady, his face unreadable. For men like him, cruelty wasn't evil, it was sport. "She'll be fine," he muttered, settling into his favorite chair. "Girls like her always cry a little, then get over it." Liam grinned, rubbing his neck. She was acting too uptight lately anyway. Maybe this'll loosen her up. He said it like he was talking about fixing a machine, not a person. To him, Sophie wasn't a wife, she was a mirror for his ego. When she stopped smiling, his reflection cracked. They turned on the TV. Some finance channel played softly in the background charts. Numbers, smooth voices discussing the markets. Richard liked control, and money was the language he spoke best. As long as his bank account was healthy, nothing else felt real enough to matter. There's something unsettling about people who live inside their own echo chamber. They start to believe consequences are optional, that life bends to their convenience. Maybe that's why they didn't notice how the night outside was shifting. Maybe that's why they didn't hear the first small crack forming in their perfect world. Richard leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "You should probably call her tomorrow," he said lazily. "Make sure she's not telling her mother some nonsense." Liam chuckled. "She'll come home before then. She always does." He believed it. He'd spent years teaching Sophie to minimize her pain, to believe that forgiveness was her job and cruelty was a misunderstanding. It's a lesson too many women learn the hard way. For a few minutes they sat there in silence. The ice clinked softly in their glasses. The lake outside was still reflecting the glow from their windows, calm and deceptive. It's strange how calmness can hide chaos. Then the phone rang. Not a cell phone, but the landline, the one they kept for business and for appearances for important people. The sharp sound cut through the room like a blade. Liam frowned. "Who's calling this late?" Richard didn't answer. He picked up the receiver, his voice slow and measured. Vaughan residence. He listened for a moment. His expression didn't change much, but his jaw tightened slightly. Yes, he said. Understood. Then he hung up, poured another drink, and exhaled through his nose. Who was that? Liam asked. The hospital, Richard said flatly. They said Sophie's alive. Some fisherman pulled her out. She's in intensive care. Liam blinked. For a second, maybe less, the colour drained from his face. But then he laughed, quick and forced. Well, that's good, right? She's fine. Richard didn't look at him. It's an inconvenience, he said. She'll make a scene. But she won't do anything. She never does. They didn't talk about guilt. They didn't talk about responsibility. They talked about damage control. That's the thing about people who think they're untouchable. They never imagine the ground could open beneath them. But that phone call wasn't just a warning. It was the first tremor of something much bigger, something they couldn't see coming. They didn't know that while they were sipping their expensive scotch and dismissing my daughter's life as a minor disturbance, someone else had already begun to move in the dark. Andrew had answered the call, and this time silence would no longer protect them. The next morning came wrapped in the dull grey light that always follows a storm. I hadn't slept. The night had blurred into one long stretch of hospital noise, the distant hum of machines. Soft footsteps in the hallway, the steady rhythm of Sophie's heart monitor. Every beat reminded me she was still here, but barely. When the nurse finally said I could see her, I walked into the ICU as if through water. Sophie lay there, small and fragile, her skin pale against the white sheets. A bandage circled her head. Tubes and wires connected her to a world that had almost let her die. I stood beside her and touched her hand. It was cold, but it twitched slightly under my fingers. That tiny movement, her fighting back, was enough to steady me. A doctor appeared at the foot of the bed, explaining things I barely heard. Head trauma, severe hypothermia, possible memory gaps. He used words like stabilized and monitoring. They were words meant to reassure, but none of them could erase the image of her sinking beneath the water while they laughed. After he left, I sat down again. The room was quiet except for the soft whirring of machines. I thought about everything my daughter had endured to be accepted by that family. The small humiliations, the constant apologies, the endless need to prove she was good enough. I used to tell her that patience was strength, but sitting there watching her fight for breath, I finally understood that patience without boundaries is just another word for surrender. My thoughts were interrupted by a vibration in my coat pocket. Sophie's phone. The screen lit up with a name that twisted my stomach. My sweetheart, Liam. For a second, I considered ignoring it. But then I remembered how he had smiled as he left her drowning, and I swiped the screen. Hello? I said. There was a pause. Then his voice, calm, careless, slightly annoyed. Sophie. What the hell happened last night? Dad got a call from the hospital. You scared everyone. Mum says you... He stopped. He knew my voice now. Emma, he said slowly. Where's Sophie? She's alive, I replied. My voice was quiet, almost calm. Too calm. He hesitated, searching for control. Put her on the phone. She can't talk right now, I said. She's resting. Well, tell her to stop overreacting. We were just playing around. You're making this a bigger deal than it is. I didn't answer. Silence stretched between us like a blade. Then I spoke steady and low. Don't come here. He tried to say something, but I ended the call before he could. The sound of the line cutting off was sharp and final. I stared at the phone for a moment before setting it on the bedside table. The screen went dark, but its reflection lingered in my mind. For years, that house had held all the power, but not anymore. Something in me had shifted. I wasn't pleading for decency anymore. I was preparing for war. Later that afternoon, a nurse approached me with a hesitant smile. "Mrs. Walker, you have a delivery." She handed me a large vase filled with white lilies, so many that their scent filled the entire corridor. It was a heavy, suffocating fragrance, the kind that belongs at funerals, not recoveries. Tucked between the flowers was a white envelope. I already knew who it was from before I even opened it. The card inside was written in elegant, expensive handwriting. Just one line. "Let's not let your mother's theatrics ruin our fun." I read it twice. My fingers didn't shake. My face didn't move. Every letter burned like a match inside me. I folded the note carefully and slid it into my coat pocket beside my phone. The nurse looked at me, confused by my silence. "Would you like me to place these in your room?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "Please throw them away. My daughter is allergic to lilies." She hesitated, unsure, then nodded and carried the flowers off down the hall. The heavy perfume faded as she disappeared around the corner. When the air finally cleared, I felt like I could breathe again. I sat back in the chair outside Sophie's room. The hallway lights flickered softly overhead, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely still. That note wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a provocation. It was a declaration of war, and I had just accepted it. I looked through the glass at my daughter's face, peaceful beneath the hum of machines. For years, I'd believed the only way to survive was to endure quietly, but quiet endurance had almost cost me everything. Now there would be no more silence, no more waiting for justice to appear on its own. As I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushed the folded note. It was warm against my skin like a promise. This was no longer about anger. It was about balance, restoring something that had been broken for far too long. And as the night settled over the hospital, I whispered to myself what I already knew deep down. This war had only just begun. 2 days passed before Andrew called. His voice came through the line, rough and low, the kind of tone that told me he hadn't slept. I could hear the faint scratch of a lighter in the background, the soft exhale of smoke. That was always his rhythm, restless, methodical, dangerous. I found something he said without introduction. He never wasted words. When he spoke like that, it meant the world was about to shift. He told me about an old police file he had pulled from an archived county record, a case from 22 years ago. The report was short, vague, almost too clean. It said that a man named Harold Pierce, a former business partner of Richard Vaughan, had drowned in Frostlake during a late-night fishing trip. The official story accident, no witnesses. But Andrew didn't believe in coincidences, and neither did I. He'd already tracked down the detective who'd handled the case, a retired officer named Ron Healy. The man had moved to the foothills to raise bees, maybe to atone for something he couldn't live with. Andrew paid him a visit. At first, Healy denied everything, said it had been a simple drowning, that the paperwork matched the facts. But Andrew had that way of talking, slow, persuasive, relentless. He didn't threaten. He just waited until the silence became unbearable. And then the truth came out. Healy admitted he'd been pressured to close the case quickly. He was given an envelope of cash and a photograph of his daughter, a college student at the time. 1 week later, the report was stamped accidental death, and the file disappeared into the archives. Harold Pierce had been about to expose Richard for embezzling millions from their joint company. He had letters, signed documents, proof that would have destroyed the Vaughan name. He told his sister in one of those letters that he planned to meet the district attorney after that fishing trip. But he never came back. As Andrew read that part to me, the room seemed to shrink around me. I could almost smell the lake water again, the same cold air that had clung to my jacket that night. Frostlake, the same place, the same darkness. 22 years apart, two drownings, both connected to the same man. Andrew kept talking, his voice steady but heavier now. Pierce's son still lives in Oakland, works as a mechanic. He saved all the letters his father wrote before he died. He knows what happened, but he never had the means to fight. He's willing to talk. I pressed the phone to my ear and stared out the hospital window. Below me, the parking lot shimmered with puddles from a passing storm. The world looked calm again, but I knew better. Calm is just what guilt looks like before it's exposed. Andrew's words kept echoing in my head. Same lake, same story, different victims. It wasn't an accident. It never had been. The pieces fit too perfectly. The lies, the silence, the way power buries its own crimes. I realized that Frostlake had never just been a place. It was a mirror reflecting everything Richard Vaughan thought he could hide forever. My brother paused, then said quietly, "You were right to call me Emma. This isn't just about Sophie anymore. It's about justice, 22 years overdue." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to laugh at the irony of it all, how the same water that nearly took my daughter's life was now about to wash everything clean. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. Do whatever it takes. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees. It sounded like the lake itself was breathing restless after so many years of silence. Somewhere deep in those waters, the past was beginning to stir. And this time, it wasn't going back to sleep. By the third day, Sophie began to open her eyes again. The doctors called it progress. I called it a miracle. Her voice was faint, like someone waking from a bad dream, and when she finally spoke, her first word wasn't "Mum," it was "why." Why had they done this? Why had she believed for so long that cruelty was love dressed as family tradition? There was no answer that could heal that kind of betrayal. But at least now she was seeing the truth. For years, Sophie had tried to be accepted by the Vaughans. She believed that patience would earn her peace. Now she understood that patience only protected her abusers. When Andrew arrived at the hospital later that morning, he carried no flowers, no food, just a worn leather satchel stuffed with documents. His eyes were tired, but burning with quiet focus, the look of a man who had already walked too far into the dark to turn back. He set the bag on the table and pulled out copies of old letters, photos, and typed transcripts. "This isn't revenge," he said. "It's exposure. We're not fighting fire with fire, we're pulling back the curtain." Andrew had been digging non-stop since our last call. He found everything: corruption, fraud, the cover-up, even a chain of bribes that linked Vaughan's company to public officials. For decades they had paid their way out of consequences. But not this time. I listened quietly as he explained the plan. He had already reached out to a handful of independent journalists, people who cared more about truth than headlines. They had verified the documents and traced the money. The next step was to make it public, all of it. When he said those words, I felt something shift inside me again. For so long I had dreamed of confronting them face to face, of screaming until they broke. But Andrew was right. True justice doesn't need noise. It just needs light. That night, while Sophie slept, I sat by her bed and watched her chest rise and fall. The steady rhythm of her breathing reminded me of how fragile life is, and how strong it can become when truth finally replaces fear. She stirred and opened her eyes. "Mum," she whispered. Did he call? Yes, I said softly, and I answered. Her eyes widened, but I smiled. You don't need to worry, we're handling it. She turned her face toward the window. The world outside was changing color, the first hints of dawn spreading over the city. I just want it to stop, she said. I don't want them to hurt anyone else. They won't, I told her. Not anymore. Later, I found Andrew sitting in the hospital cafe, typing furiously on his laptop. A dozen files were open on the screen. Emails, old contracts, and a draft of something that made my pulse quicken. At the top, in bold letters, was the title, Frostlake Lies, the Vaughan Legacy of Power, Corruption, and Death. He didn't even look up when I approached. It's scheduled, he said. Once I hit publish, it'll go out everywhere. Major outlets, independent sites, social media feeds. They'll try to bury it, but they won't be fast enough. I sat down across from him, my hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. When tomorrow morning, he said. 8 a.m. There was no turning back now. The Vaughans had always relied on fear to keep people quiet. Fear of losing jobs, reputations, families. But fear only works when truth is hidden. Once exposed, it burns away like fog in sunlight. Andrew closed his laptop, finally meeting my eyes. Once this goes live, he said they'll know exactly who did it. Are you ready for that? I thought of Sophie's pale face, of her voice trembling when she asked why. I thought of the night she almost died while they laughed. Then I nodded. Yes, I said. Let them know. That evening I walked past the hospital's reflection in the glass doors, one woman carrying the weight of 2 generations. But this time, I wasn't walking away from fear. I was walking straight into justice. And somewhere in the silence before dawn, I could almost hear the sound of water stirring again at Frostlake, calm, cold, and waiting for the truth to rise. The morning the story went live, the Vaughan mansion no longer felt invincible. For the first time in decades, Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing, not from clients or friends, but from people he thought were loyal, suddenly turning cold. He had spent his entire life building walls of influence, judges, politicians, police chiefs, all bought and paid for with the precision of a man who believed every favor had a price. But now those walls were cracking. His name was on every news channel. Words like fraud, bribery, and cover-up scrolled across the bottom of screens he once used to showcase his success. Richard sat behind his massive oak desk, staring at the phone as if sheer will could make it ring with good news. When it finally did, he grabbed the receiver like a lifeline. The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend from the state office, one who used to owe him more than one favor. Jim Richard said, his tone forced calm. You've seen what's online. I need this taken down. Just a temporary freeze until we sort it out. Silence, then a sigh. Richard, the man, said quietly, You've gone too far this time. I can't touch it. Everyone's seen it. My name can't be anywhere near yours. The line went dead before Richard could respond. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed. The empire he had built on fear and silence was unraveling, and no amount of money could tape it back together. Across the room, Liam stood by the window, staring out at the empty driveway. The confident smirk that had once been his signature was gone. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance that had always shielded him from consequences. Dad, he said. Finally, his voice low. What are we going to do? Richard didn't answer right away. He poured himself a drink, but his hand trembled just enough to spill a drop on the desk. The sight of it enraged him. Fear wasn't something he recognized in himself. Do, he muttered, staring into the glass. "We stop this before it spreads. It's already everywhere," Liam said, scrolling through his phone. "The article's on every site. Reporters are calling the house. They know everything, the lake, the money, even Pierce's letters." Richard slammed his hand down, shattering the glass. Shards scattered across the floor, glittering under the morning light. "Then we find out who gave them that information," he said coldly. "Someone fed them the story. Someone close." Liam hesitated. "You think it's her?" Emma Richard looked up sharply. "No, she's not that clever. But she's got help. That brother of hers, the journalist, Andrew." He paced the room, every step slower and heavier. "He's the one pulling the strings. He wants to destroy me." "Fine. If it's a game he wants, I'll show him what happens when you challenge a Vaughan. Dad." Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should." "Enough," Richard snapped. "You don't negotiate with rats. You cut off their air before they can squeak." He grabbed his phone again and dialed a private number, one he hadn't used in years. When a gravelly voice answered, Richard's tone turned cold and deliberate. "I need someone found," he said. "Name's Andrew Walker. Journalist. Get to him before anyone else does." A pause, then the voice replied, "You want it quiet." "As quiet as the bottom of Frostlake," Richard said. He hung up and stood there for a long moment, breathing hard. Outside, the clouds were gathering heavy and grey, pressing against the windows like a warning. In that silence, even Liam could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of something ending. For the first time, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't mocking. He was afraid. And deep down, he knew what his father refused to admit. Once the truth surfaces, no one can drag it back underwater. But Richard Vaughan wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. By the time Richard's men reached the old apartment on the east side of town, the sky had already turned the colour of bruised steel. The building was one of those forgotten places, peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, the faint smell of damp carpet that never really dries. They climbed the stairs, fast, heavy boots echoing off the concrete walls. The door they stopped at was labelled 4B. It looked fragile, like a single kick could send it flying. And that's exactly what happened. One man stepped back, threw his shoulder into it, and the lock splintered with a sharp crack. They charged inside, expecting chaos, expecting to find Andrew Walker crouched behind a desk, surrounded by computers and files. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the still air of a place that hadn't been lived in for years. Dust covered every surface. A broken lamp leaned against the wall. Newspapers from another decade sat in a pile by the window. The kitchen faucet dripped once, then fell silent again. They had kicked open a ghost's door. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the men muttered a curse under his breath. They had walked straight into a setup, a decoy. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, Andrew sat in a quiet hotel room that smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke. The curtains were drawn, the light dim. His laptop glowed in front of him, bathing his face in cold blue. He had been up all night, cross-checking, rereading, rewriting every line until there was nothing left to fix. On the screen, the title was simple, but devastating: Frostlake, the 22-year lie. Below it were names, dates, scanned letters, photographs, recording evidence of everything Richard Vaughan had spent a lifetime burying. Andrew checked the clock. 8:00 a.m. sharp. He took a breath, slow and deep, the kind people take before stepping into something irreversible. He thought of Emma, of Sophie, of the quiet strength in their voices when the world had written them off. He thought of the lake, the silence, the truth that had slept beneath it for too long. Then he moved the cursor to the button. Publish, one click. and the world exploded. The post hit the internet like a lightning strike. Within seconds, it was shared, mirrored, reposted, screenshotted, and translated. First, a handful of journalists picked it up, then regional outlets, and within an hour, national headlines were flashing across every major news feed. Corporate mogul linked to 22-year-old death. Frostlake cover-up exposed, exclusive inside the Vaughan family empire. The emails began pouring out automatically, sent to prosecutors, watchdog groups, and media contacts across the country. There was no stopping it now. Even if someone tried to delete the post, the copies were already everywhere, archived, downloaded, backed up on servers around the world. The system Richard had relied on, money power silence, collapsed in real time. His calls went unanswered. His partners fled. The very people who once smiled at his jokes were now denying they'd ever met him. Andrew leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and closed his laptop. The hotel room around him was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just sat there, still listening to the sound of truth moving through the world like a wave. Back in that empty apartment, Richard's men stood frozen among the dust, realizing too late that they weren't the hunters anymore, they were part of the story. Somewhere above them, a TV blared from another room, already broadcasting the headline they had failed to prevent. And as the world watched, the Vaughan Empire, built on fear, lies, and the illusion of power, finally began to crumble. There was no way to stop it. The truth had been set free. By noon, the world had turned upside down. What began as a single story on a small independent news site had exploded into a national reckoning. Every major outlet picked it up: cable networks, newspapers, podcasts, social media lit up like wildfire. Hashtags, trended screenshots spread, and within hours the Vaughan name had gone from a symbol of influence to a cautionary tale. The internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. Every piece of evidence Andrew had uploaded, emails, financial trails, sworn statements, was dissected, verified, and reposted by thousands. There was nowhere to hide. What Richard Vaughan had spent decades controlling with money and fear was now collapsing in real time under the weight of truth. The footage of their arrest aired that evening. The scene looked almost cinematic. Two black SUVs pulling up to the Vaughan mansion. Agents in dark suits walking up the marble steps, Richard in his pressed suit and hollow expression as he opened the door. Liam stood behind him, pale and shaking. The cameras caught everything. The flash of handcuffs, the reporters shouting questions, the chaos of a man watching his empire turn to dust. They were charged with multiple counts: corporate fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a death. But beneath the legal language was something simpler, a reckoning long overdue. Richard's assets were frozen before sunset. Partners withdrew, stock values plummeted, and old allies scrambled to distance themselves. One by one, the people who had once laughed at his dinner table deleted his number. Even the walls of his mansion seemed smaller now, stripped of their arrogance, heavy with silence. Liam was booked alongside his father. For the first time, he didn't smirk or deflect. His face looked lost, like a man finally realizing that cruelty isn't power, it's weakness, pretending to be strength. Across the city, the hospital TV played the breaking news in muted tones. The headline banner read, "Vaughan, father and son, taken into custody." I watched from the waiting room, a paper cup of coffee cooling in my hands. People around me whispered, recognizing the story that had consumed the internet. Some gasped, others clucked their tongues in disbelief. I didn't say a word. There was no satisfaction in watching justice unfold, not for me. The world might have seen it as victory, but to me it felt like quiet inevitability. Nothing could undo what they'd done to my daughter, to our lives, to all the people they'd trampled along the way. Justice wasn't meant to feel sweet. It was meant to restore balance. On the screen, Richard's face appeared one last time as he was led into a police car. For a moment, his eyes met the camera. Gone was the confidence, the control, the smirk that used to make others flinch. In its place was something unfamiliar: fear. The kind of fear that comes when a man realizes he no longer owns the world around him. I turned away from the TV. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the city in gold and ash. Sophie was still resting upstairs, her recovery slow but steady. Life was beginning to move forward, quietly, stubbornly. Andrew texted me a single line: "It's done." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The story had already left our hands. It belonged to the world now, to every reader who saw through the lies, to every person who believed truth still mattered. I threw away the cold coffee and walked towards Sophie's room. Her door was half open, light, spilling through like a promise. And for the first time in months, I let myself breathe. Not because the Vaughns had fallen, but because the silence had finally broken. And sometimes that's the only justice we can ask for. The weeks after the arrest felt both heavy and hollow, like the air after a storm. The world outside kept talking: reporters, strangers online, people with opinions about justice and punishment. But inside that hospital room, time moved differently. Quieter, slower. Sophie was healing. The colour was back in her cheeks, and her voice had strength again. But something deeper had changed too. The girl who once smiled to keep the peace was gone. What remained was a woman who finally saw the truth for what it was and wasn't afraid of it anymore. When the divorce papers came, she didn't cry. She didn't shake or hesitate. She just signed her name and closed the folder. There was no need for drama, no speeches about betrayal or forgiveness. Some endings don't deserve an audience. A few days later, a nurse brought her a thick envelope. It was from Liam. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, impatient. Inside were several handwritten pages full of apologies, half explanations, and memories twisted to sound like love. She read the first few lines, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she tore the letter in half, then again and again, until only scraps remained in her lap. She gathered the pieces in her palm, walked to the trash bin, and dropped them in. That moment said more than any words could. It wasn't revenge, it was release. When Sophie was discharged from the hospital, we packed what little we had into a few cardboard boxes. No jewelry, no designer bags, no traces of the life she'd shared with them. Just essentials: books, photos, small keepsakes that carried meaning instead of price tags. We didn't speak much that day. We didn't need to. Our silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, like the sound of rebuilding after the noise has finally stopped. As we taped the last box shut, I looked at my daughter. She wasn't fragile anymore. She was focused, ready, and for the first time in a long while, we were moving not away from something but towards something new. That evening, as the movers loaded the truck, Sophie stood at the door, her hand resting on the frame. She didn't look back. We didn't belong in that house of ghosts. We had somewhere better to be. The apartment was smaller than I remembered, but it felt right. The floors still creaked in the same spots, and the windows still overlooked the quiet street, lined with maple trees. The public library sat across the corner, its stone walls unchanged since Sophie was a child. When I opened the door for the first time, the smell of dust and old paint filled the air. It didn't matter. It was ours again. I had bought it back, a two-bedroom apartment we once sold to help fund her marriage. Life has a way of circling back, sometimes painfully, but this time it felt like a second chance. We spent the first day unpacking and laughing at how strange it felt to have nothing fancy, but everything real. Sophie found her old bookshelf, the one covered in stickers she'd added as a teenager. I watched as she ran her fingers along the worn wood, smiling not the polite smile she used to wear like armor, but a real unguarded one. It was small, but it was enough to break the weight I'd been carrying for months. That night, we ate dinner on the floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The food was simple instant noodles and store-bought soup, but it tasted better than any meal in that mansion ever had. Sophie looked at me and said softly, "It feels like home again." I nodded, feeling something loosen in my chest. It is home. There was no more pretending, no more fear, just two women rebuilding what was taken from them piece by piece, truth by truth. As I turned off the lights, I looked at her once more and said almost to myself, "It's time to finish the story we started." And she smiled, like she understood exactly what that meant. Months passed, and life began to find its rhythm again. The noise around the Vaughns faded. People moved on to new scandals, new distractions. But for us, peace wasn't about headlines, it was about breathing freely without fear or pretense. I often thought about what justice really means. Is it punishment exposure? Or something quieter, like restoring order where chaos once ruled? Many people called what I did revenge. Maybe they were right, partly. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about ending the silence that let them destroy others. The world doesn't always give you justice wrapped neatly in court decisions. Sometimes justice is simply the act of telling the truth out loud. As I sat by the window of our little apartment one evening, the city lights flickering beyond the trees, I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the pain, the loss, and the strange calm that came after. I realized I didn't hate Richard or Liam anymore. Hatred would have kept me chained to them. What I felt now was something different. Closure. I looked over at Sophie, who was writing in her journal by the window. Her face was soft, thoughtful, alive. The lake hadn't broken her, it had washed away everything false. I turned back to the window and whispered to myself, maybe justice isn't about revenge after all. Maybe it's about restoring balance. And then, as if answering that thought, the night breeze carried in the sound of laughter from the street below. Life was still moving forward, but now I want to ask you, if you were in my place, if you had seen what I saw what I lost, would you have done the same? Would you have stayed silent and trusted the system? Or would you have fought back, even if it meant breaking the rules to make things right? Tell me what you think. Comment below. Share your story. Because sometimes the hardest question isn't what we've done, it's what we would do if it happened to us. And maybe somewhere in that answer, we'll all find our own version of justice.